Have you ever wondered how silence changes over time? At first, silence feels peaceful. A few days pass and it's simply a pause. A few weeks pass and people begin to wonder. A few months pass and that silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a question, a mystery, a story people start telling themselves. Where did they go? What happened? And are they ever coming back? For a while, this podcast became that silence. The episode stopped, the microphone sat untouched, the stories went untold, and somewhere out there, maybe a few of you wondered what happened. Maybe you checked for a new episode every now and then. Maybe you forgot about the show entirely. Or maybe, just maybe, you assumed it had quietly disappeared into the endless noise of the internet. And honestly, I can't blame you, because things disappear all the time. People leave, places are abandoned, entire civilizations rise, fall, and vanish. Sometimes they leave behind clues, sometimes they leave behind ruins, and sometimes they leave behind absolutely nothing. Tonight marks the return of Mindful Progress, a journey, hosted by Torrid Embrox, myself. But instead of simply saying, I'm back, I thought we'd start with a story. Not a story about monsters, not a story about ghosts, not even a story about something supernatural. Because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that actually happened, the ones that leave historians scratching their heads centuries later, the ones that refuse to give us answers. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that an entire civilization or an entire community has vanished. Men, women, children, gone. No bodies, no signs of violence, no explanation, just an empty settlement and a single word carved into wood. A word that would become one of history's greatest mysteries. For more than 400 years, people have searched for answers. Explorers, historians, archaeologists, writers, dreamers. Yet even today, nobody can say with certainty what happened, because unlike this podcast, they never came back. Tonight, we travel back to the late 16th century, to a small English settlement on the edge of an unknown world, a colony built on hope, a colony swallowed by uncertainty, a colony that disappeared so completely that it became legend. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke. To understand how an entire colony could disappear, we first need to understand the world they came from. Let's leave behind the modern world for a moment. No airplanes, no satellites, no GPS, no internet, no maps accurate enough to tell you what waited beyond the horizon. Instead, imagine standing on the shores of England in the late 1500s. The world feels smaller than it does today. but it is also infinitely more mysterious. Entire continents remain unknown to most Europeans. Stories of distant lands circulate through taverns and royal courts alike. Some speak of unimaginable riches, others tell tales of strange creatures and endless wilderness. And somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean lies a place many simply call the New World. For centuries, the Atlantic had been a barrier, a vast and dangerous ocean separating Europe from most lands most people would never see. Crossing it was not an adventure, it was a gamble. Ships vanished, storms swallowed entire crews, navigation was primitive. Many who sailed west never returned, but despite the danger, the promise of opportunity proved irresistible. Because Europe was changing, empires were expanding, nations were competing, and England was beginning to feel left behind. Spain had already established powerful colonies across the Americas. Gold and silver flowed back to Europe. Spanish influence was growing stronger every year. Meanwhile, England watched, and England wanted a piece of that future. One of the most determined to make that future a reality was Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, history tends to remember Raleigh as an explorer, but that description doesn't quite capture who he was. Raleigh was ambitious, exceptionally ambitious, a soldier, a writer, a politician, and perhaps most importantly, a dreamer. He believed England's future depended on establishing permanent settlements in the New World, not temporary expeditions, not trading posts, actual colonies, places where English families could build home, raise children, and create entirely new communities across the ocean. To many people, the idea sounded impossible, but Raleigh had something incredibly valuable: the support of Queen Elizabeth I, and with royal backing came resources, influence, and opportunity. In 1584, Raleigh sponsored an expedition to explore the eastern coast of North America. The explorers arrived at a chain of islands off the coast of what is now North Carolina. What they found seemed promising: dense forests, abundant wildlife, fertile land, natural harbors. The area appeared capable of supporting a settlement. The explorers returned to England with glowing reports, and perhaps more importantly, they returned with stories: stories of opportunity, stories of possibility, stories that transformed an unknown coastline into a destination. The land was named Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth, often called the Virgin Queen. To Raleigh and his supporters, Virginia represented something more than territory. It represented a future. But there was one detail often overlooked in those optimistic reports. The land was not empty. Far from it. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, indigenous people had lived there for generations. Entire communities already called the region home. They had their own cultures, their own traditions, their own relationships with the land. To European settlers, the wilderness often appeared untouched, but that perception was an illusion. The forests, rivers, and coastlines were part of a world that already belonged to someone else, and that reality would become critically important later. The first encounters between English explorers and indigenous communities were complex. Some were friendly, others were cautious, many involved trade. Information was exchanged, goods changed hands, curiosity flowed in both directions. Imagine seeing someone from an entirely different world, different language, different clothing, different customs. Both sides were trying to understand each other, and both sides were making assumptions, some accurate, many not. At first, cooperation seemed possible, perhaps even likely, but history has a way of complicating optimism. Back in England, excitement continued to grow. Exploration was becoming colonization. Dreams were becoming plans. Ships were being prepared. Supplies were being gathered. Volunteers were being recruited. Men eager for adventure signed up. Others hoped for wealth. Some simply wanted a fresh start. They were told they would help establish England's future, that they would become pioneers, builders of a new society, founders of something historic. What they could not know, what nobody could know, was that they were walking into one of history's greatest mysteries. Think about that for a moment. The people we're about to meet were not characters in a legend. They were real human beings. They had hopes, families, dreams, fears. They laughed, they argued, they worried about the future, just like we do. And when they boarded those ships, they believed they were sailing toward opportunity, not toward disappearance. The Atlantic Ocean stretched before them, an ocean capable of inspiring wonder and terror in equal measure. Weeks of open water, violent storms, unpredictable currents, disease, isolation. Every mile carried them farther from everything familiar, farther from England, farther from safety, closer to uncertainty, closer to Roanoke, closer to a mystery that would survive for more than 4 centuries. And so the ships sailed west, toward an unfamiliar coastline, toward a future nobody could predict, toward a colony that would one day become famous not for what it achieved, but for what happened after everyone was gone. In the next chapter of our story, the English make their first serious attempt to establish a settlement at Roanoke, and almost immediately things begin to go wrong. History often remembers Roanoke for the mystery, the disappearance, the word carved into wood, the empty settlement. But before any of that happened, there was another colony, another group of settlers, another warning, one that almost nobody listened to. In 1585, just 1 year after the first exploratory voyage returned to England, Sir Walter Raleigh launched a much larger expedition. This time, the goal was no longer exploration, it was occupation. The English intended to establish a permanent foothold in the New World, more than 600 years before social media, more than 300 years before telephones. These settlers would effectively vanish from England the moment their ships disappeared beyond the horizon. Communication would take months, help would take months, everything would take months, and once they arrived, they would be on their own. The fleet crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the coast of present-day North Carolina. Among the leaders was a man named Ralph Lane. Lane was chosen to govern the settlement. He was a soldier, disciplined, experienced, but there was a problem. Being a soldier and being a colony leader were not necessarily the same thing. One skill involved conquering problems, the other involved living with them, and Roanoke was about to provide many. At first, things seemed promising. The settlers established a base on Roanoke Island. Wooden structures began to rise, supplies were unloaded, maps were drawn, plans were made. Once again, hope filled the air. Imagine standing there, looking out over the water, watching ships disappear back toward England, knowing you were helping build something completely new. The first generation of English colonists in a land few people back home could even imagine. For a brief moment, the dream felt real. But dreams have a way of changing once reality arrives. The settlers quickly discovered that surviving in the New World was far more difficult than exploring it. Food became a concern. Fresh water sources were limited. The environment was unfamiliar. The climate was different. The seasons behaved differently than expected. And perhaps most importantly, the colony depended heavily on nearby indigenous communities. In England, many people imagined the New World as a place overflowing with opportunity, a place where resources simply waited to be collected. But survival required knowledge, knowledge of local crops, knowledge of fishing grounds, knowledge of weather patterns, and knowledge the English did not possess. The indigenous people did, however, and for a time relationships between the two groups remained relatively cooperative. Trade occurred, food was exchanged, information was shared, but trust is fragile, especially when cultures collide. As months passed, tensions began to grow, misunderstandings multiplied, competition for resources increased, small conflicts emerged, and in frontier environments, small conflicts rarely remain small. Both sides viewed the other through lenses of uncertainty. Every disagreement carried consequences. Every misunderstanding planted another seed of distrust. The settlers were far from home. The local communities were watching outsiders establish themselves on land they had inhabited for generations. Neither side fully understood the other, and that uncertainty became dangerous. One incident in particular changed everything. An English silver cup went missing. To modern listeners, this might sound insignificant. A stolen cup, hardly the beginning of a major crisis. But in 1585, the settlers interpreted the theft as an act of hostility. Rather than seeking a peaceful resolution, English forces launched a retaliatory attack against a nearby village. The consequences were immediate. Trust collapsed, relationships deteriorated, suspicion replaced cooperation, and suddenly the colony found itself in a much more vulnerable position. This is one of the recurring themes throughout history. The moment when fear begins making decisions, once fear takes control, every action appears threatening, every misunderstanding feels deliberate, every mistake becomes evidence, and before long, people stop seeing neighbors. They start seeing enemies. Roanoke was moving steadily towards that point. Meanwhile, another problem was growing. The settlers had expected support from England, more supplies, more resources, more assistance, but the Atlantic Ocean does not operate on schedules. Ships were delayed, communication remained slow, the colony's situation became increasingly precarious, food shortages worsened, morale declined, uncertainty spread. The settlers had come seeking opportunity. Instead, many found hardship. Imagine waking each morning with no idea when help might arrive, no way to contact home, no way to know whether reinforcements were coming, no way to know whether England had forgotten you. Every passing day would make the colony feel smaller, more isolated, more vulnerable, and isolation has a way of changing people. As conditions deteriorated, Ralph Lane made a decision that would further inflame tensions. He launched military operations against local indigenous leaders he believed posed a threat. One confrontation ended in the death of Wingina, a prominent leader among the local communities. The killing deepened existing hostilities. Any remaining chance for stable relations became increasingly difficult, and now the settlers faced a terrifying reality. They were outnumbered, far from home, running low on supplies, and surrounded by people who had every reason to distrust them. The dream of Roanoke was beginning to crack, not because of monsters, not because of curses, not because of anything supernatural, but because reality is often more difficult than fantasy. And survival depends on cooperation more than conquest. By the summer of 1586, the colony was struggling. The settlers needed help, desperately. Fortunately for them, help arrived, although perhaps not in the form anyone expected. A fleet commanded by the famous English navigator Sir Francis Drake arrived near the settlement. To the exhausted colonists, it must have felt like salvation, a connection to home, a chance to escape uncertainty, a chance to leave. And leave they did. Many of the settlers chose to abandon Roanoke entirely. They boarded Drake's ships and returned to England. The first Roanoke colony was over, just like that. The settlement was abandoned, its buildings left behind. its ambitions temporarily shattered, its future uncertain. But here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Just days after the colonists departed, another English supply ship finally arrived. It had crossed Atlantic carrying provisions and reinforcements, the help the colony had desperately needed, the help that arrived too late. Finding the settlement deserted, the crew left behind a small detachment of men to maintain England's claim to the territory. Then they departed. Think about that timing. Weeks, days, even hours can change history. Had circumstances unfolded slightly differently, the story of Roanoke might have ended there. No mystery, no lost colony, no centuries of speculation. Just another struggling settlement. Instead, history gave Roanoke a second chance, and that second chance would become legendary. Back in England, Sir Walter Raleigh refused to abandon his dream. The first colony had failed, but failures can be explained. Failures can be corrected. Failures can be tried again. Raleigh remained convinced that a successful settlement was possible. All he needed was a new group of colonists, a better plan, and a little luck. Unfortunately for everyone involved, luck would not be arriving with the next expedition. The first settlement had survived only briefly, but the colony that followed would become one of history's greatest mysteries, because unlike the soldiers and adventurers who came before them, the next settlers would bring something far more precious: families, children, and the hope of a permanent future. Thank you all for listening. This was the part 1 of the episode about Roanoke. I will be going more in depth in part 2, and there will probably be a part 3 as well. Again, I'm really sorry for disappearing the last one, but I've been really busy and I barely made it in time for the deadline of this month, which was every last Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. But I'm back from good. I'm back for good, and I will be releasing episodes monthly once again. Part 2 will be out in the scheduled time, so don't worry about it. And I hope you enjoyed part 1. I have already taken up a lot of time, so I won't be continuing this episode any longer, because I value your time and I value your patience as well. So I will be seeing you next month and the last Friday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, with part 2 of Roanoke. Hope to see you there. Torrid Embrox signing off, and this was Mindful Progress, a Journey.